In 1999, a console launched that had online multiplayer built in, downloadable content, a web browser, and some of the most creative titles that the industry had seen up to that point. It predicted the future of gaming almost perfectly, and in less than 2 years, it had died off. But the strangest thing about the Dreamcast isn't that it failed, it's that the industry that created it doesn't even exist anymore. And that's why there will never be another console like the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast felt like the future. When the Dreamcast launched on September 9th, 1999, it didn't feel like just another console release. It felt like a statement. Sega marketed it aggressively in North America, and the launch was huge. The system sold over 500,000 units in the first 2 weeks in the United States alone, which was massive at that time. The hardware itself really stood out. It was very ahead of its time. The Dreamcast included something that would later define modern gaming, which is built-in internet connectivity. Every Dreamcast shipped with a modem. Out of the box, you could go online, you could browse the web, download content, and you could play multiplayer games over the internet in 1999. Today, that sounds like normal. It's nothing special. In 1999, that was ridiculous. Okay, most households were still using dial-up modems back then. Broadband was still very rare, and online gaming was mostly limited to PC players. But Sega believed that online gaming was the future, and they were right. Okay, Sega's arcade DNA, right? To really understand the Dreamcast, you have to understand the company behind it. Sega wasn't just another console manufacturer. For decades, Sega was one of the most important arcade companies in the entire world. Okay? Arcades shaped how Sega designed games. Arcade games had to really grab your attention basically immediately. They had to be colorful, they had to be fast, they had to be exciting and easy to understand within seconds of you playing for the first time. And more importantly, those games had to be fun. Okay? The philosophy that carried from these arcade games translated directly into the Dreamcast. Okay? Many of the biggest games were actually built on hardware very similar to the Sega arcade boards. Okay? This meant that the Dreamcast games could deliver near perfect arcade ports, something that had always been difficult for home consoles before then. Games like Soul Calibur, Crazy Taxi, House of the Dead 2 looked and played almost exactly like their arcade counterparts. But Sega didn't stop there. Sega started to experiment. Okay, the Dreamcast had one of the weirdest and most novel libraries ever created. Okay, the Dreamcast had one of the strangest and most creative game libraries of all time. And that's not just me being nostalgic, because even today, it really felt weird, but in the best possible way. You had Crazy Taxi, where the entire game was about driving a taxi like a madman, while punk rock blares in the background. You had Jet Set Radio, which was a graffiti spraying rollerblading game that introduced a shell-shaded graphics to mainstream audiences. You had Power Stone, which was a fantastic game. Power Stone was a chaotic 3D arena fighter where players could throw furniture, transform into super-powered versions of the characters, and you could destroy the entire stage that the characters were fighting on. And then there was Seaman, a game where you raise a fish with a human face that talks to you through a microphone and questions your life choices. This kind of creativity feels almost unheard of today. Not because developers don't want to take chances and make these strange kind of games, but because the industry structure has changed so completely as it doesn't allow them to take these kind of risk anymore. Okay, the Dreamcast took massive risk. The Dreamcast produced one of the most ambitious games ever attempted at the time, Shenmue. Shenmue was essentially a prototype for the modern open world game. It had a living city with day and night cycles. It had dynamic weather patterns. The NPCs have schedules. It had interactive environments years before those ideas became commonplace in the gaming industry. Players could explore shops, they could talk to strangers, they could play arcade games, they could collect toys, you could investigate stories about the NPCs and their lives. So what was the problem with that? The problem was it reportedly cost around $70 million to develop, which was an absurd amount of money for the late 90s, especially for a game. Sega was literally betting everything on these big ideas. Sometimes it worked, but sometimes it didn't. And the important thing here is that they were willing to try. Okay? Modern console ecosystems rarely, if ever, allow that kind of risk anymore. Okay? Another example of Sega's creativity was the Dreamcast memory card, called the VMU, or the Visual Memory Unit. Okay, this thing wasn't just a storage device. It had a screen, it had buttons, it had a speaker, and it could function as a tiny handheld system. You could literally take this out of the controller and play mini games on it. Some games even used the VMU screen in novel ways. For an example, right, in Resident Evil Code Veronica, the VMU displayed your health. In NFL 2K, it showed secret play calls so your opponent couldn't see them. These were small ideas, but they showed just how much Sega was willing to experiment with the hardware that was available to them at the time. Modern consoles never take these kind of risks because hardware mistakes today cost billions of dollars and can be the difference between success and failure of a title or a console. Okay? Then the PlayStation 2 arrived, right? Despite all the creativity, despite all the innovation, the Dreamcast had one massive problem. It launched too early. In 2000, Sony released the PlayStation 2, and the PS2 didn't just compete with the Dreamcast, it completely changed the market. Okay? The PlayStation 2 was more than just a gaming console. It was also a DVD player. Okay? At the time, DVD players were still really expensive, and the PlayStation 2 became one of the cheapest ways to get one. So suddenly, millions of people were buying the PlayStation 2 not for the games, but for the ability to watch DVDs. Okay? And developers followed the audience. Publicitors shifted their focus. Okay? Sega couldn't compete financially with Sony's momentum, not because the PlayStation 2 was necessarily a better system, and in fact you could really argue in some ways it was worse, but because the PlayStation 2 could play DVDs. Okay, Sega was already wounded. The Dreamcast also suffered from something that had been building for years in the industry. Sega had already damaged its reputation with previous hardware failures. The Sega Saturn really struggled in the Western markets. The 32X confused customers and it really fragmented Sega's audience. Okay? Retailers and consumers had really lost a lot of the trust that they used to have in the Sega hardware. So even though the Dreamcast itself, by all intents and purposes, was an excellent system, Sega was really starting the race with one hand tied behind their back. They were starting at a disadvantage. Okay? And once the PlayStation 2 hype really started gaining momentum, it just became impossible to stop. And again, it wasn't even because the PlayStation 2 was necessarily a better system, although it was a great system. It was solely because Sony was able to capitalize on the ability to play DVDs, which was something that they weren't selling just a gaming console, they were selling a DVD player, and at that time, that was truly one of the largest reasons that people bought the PlayStation 2, okay? And by the early 2001, 2002 era, Sega made a shocking announcement. They were exiting the console business forever. Okay? The Dreamcast was going to be discontinued and Sega would become a third-party developer. Okay? It was the end of an era. Okay? For the first time since the 1980s, Sega was no longer making gaming hardware. And the console industry suddenly became much smaller overnight. Okay? So, why do I think that we're never going to see another console like the Dreamcast? Well, the biggest reason we will never see another console like the Dreamcast is really simple. The gaming industry today is too big. It's just too big. Console launches now involve billions of dollars in investment, right? Studios employ thousands and thousands of developers. Games take 5 to 7 years to make, and every decision has to be carefully calculated, every decision has to be analyzed, and risk has to be minimized. Okay? Experimentation still exists in the gaming industry, but you're usually going to find that in the indie space, not on major consoles. So, the Dreamcast existed in this strange moment in time where technology was advancing rapidly, the internet was really just beginning to matter, and companies were still willing to take risk. Sega gambled everything on the Dreamcast, and unfortunately they lost. Okay? They were as much a victim of the changing times as they were truly just a victim of bad timing. But even though they really did lose everything on the Dreamcast, they left behind one of the most fascinating consoles ever made, a console that was truly ahead of its time in so many ways, and a console that's legacy lives on today in the future consoles that followed it. Okay, today the Dreamcast is truly remembered with an incredible amount of love by a growing community of enthusiasts, right? And it's not because the Dreamcast dominated the market. It's because it represented something rare in gaming history. It was a console that was bold, it was creative, it was experimental, and really slightly chaotic even. It felt like Sega was throwing every idea that it ever had into one great machine. And maybe that's why people still talk about it today, more than 20 years later. Because the Dreamcast wasn't a safe bet. It wasn't predictable, but it certainly wasn't boring. It was the last console built with real heart, with a real arcade feel that was really just a sign of the times from a bygone era. And that's exactly why I think there will never be another console like the Dreamcast. So what do you think? Do you think there's ever going to be another console like the Dreamcast? Comment down below what you want to see in a future consoles. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And that's my rant, and I'll see you next time.
Loser, loser.